Welcome back to another episode of Harmonious at Lunch, the show that fuels your business success. I'm Brandon Gano, your host and guide through the world of harmonious business growth. Today, we're unlocking powerful strategies with industry experts to help your business thrive. If you're a business owner, entrepreneur, or executive, you are in the right place. Join me and our incredible guests today on the journey to clarity, growth, and success. It is time to revolutionize your approach to business. Let's dive in with another episode of Harmonious at Lunch. Welcome back into some more bite-sized business advice. Today's episode is going to be one of my personal favorite types. It's the success story of the entrepreneur journey. And we're going to hear from somebody who started from nowhere in this very industry with podcasting, with media, and has grown a successful business. I have the CEO of Evergreen Podcasts with me, Michael DeAloia. I hope I pronounced his name right.
It's a tricky Italian name, man. I tell you, it's DeAloia.
DeAloia.
Yeah. The great thing about Cleveland is that on the west side, there's a lot of Italians. So they obviously DeAloia. On east side, you get a lot of Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans. So it's like De La Hoya. And I answer to both.
De La Hoya. I love it. Well, Michael, it's good to have you here. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
Full disclosure, we don't edit this show at all. So all of that's just going to be in there. It's going to live forever. And that's cool. I'm cool with it. But I'm curious to dive into your story. You are reading your background here, and you started a podcast from nothing, and you've grown it now into a successful media company, raising and making millions of dollars. There's a lot in between that I want to unpack for our audience. Where'd you get started in the world of podcasting though?
Well, I had started with radio. My journey's been both business and a little bit of politics, which is a strange brew, especially given the current climate. But back in the day, I was working here in the city of Cleveland for two mayors as their technology czar, which was really economic development for the technology trades in Cleveland. Meaning it was my light burden to try and turn around an old industrial city as a new technology capital in the United States. And happy to report we were able to move at that time like 38 different tech companies into the city, thousands of new jobs, and really, I hope, sparked a renaissance in Northeast Ohio and in Cleveland in particular. I've got a lot of love and admiration for this city. So it was great to be a part of that. After that, I became a columnist for the Plain Dealer, which is the daily newspaper. And I had started a radio program here locally. So it was around that time I started to hear about podcasts. And out of the radio show, we developed a podcast. I was selected as the host for the RNC when they hit Cleveland in 2016. The local economic development groups in the RNC created a little podcast highlighting entrepreneurs who obviously might have leaned a little right at the time. And so I was a host of that, and that was a really cool gig. My background, though, is as a tech entrepreneur. So while all this is going on, I had a number of tech companies and other entrepreneurial upstarts. I had sold one of those companies in 2016. I was on the beach, so to speak. My wife's an attorney. We just had a kid. My wife's a bit more conservative than me. And she was like, at some point, you probably should start working again. Just going to throw that out. And I was like, I was just hanging out with the kid. I was consulting a little bit poorly. And I just loved my life. And sure enough, she was asking me, what are you going to do if you ever go back to work? Not if, but when. I was like, I really would love to be a CEO again of a media company. And I couldn't believe I said that because I had really just tangential experience in the media world. I kid you not, 2 or 3 days later, a friend of mine calls who had interviewed for this job as the CEO of at the time, Front Porch Media, now Evergreen. And he was like, listen, I just interviewed for this job. I told him, I am not the guy, but I know the guy. You're the guy. You got to call this family office that had started this podcast company. They don't know what to do with it. So I called, and it turns out the woman who was running the front office, or this family office, and also had started this podcast business, were practically neighbors. We only lived like 3 or 4 blocks apart. We both have houses on Lake Erie here in Cleveland. So yeah, I could literally walk to the interview. And this is in October of 2016. We had 2 or 3 months where it's just heavy duty. What would you do if we gave you this company? How would you go out and, we've got some money we want to invest into it and support it, but what would you do for a future investment? How would you structure things, et cetera, et cetera? So I took the job in January of 2017. It was myself, 2 interns, and 10 terabytes of old radio programs that they wanted to turn into podcasts. And that was the start. It was in a closet, literally an old medical dental office closet in a suburb a little west of Cleveland called Lakewood, which is where I live with my family. We're behind a tanning salon. So there's a tanning salon at the retail front. In the back of that was this little office, which was how we started. And for the first 18 months, truth be told, we struggled in terms of our content, our strategy. I'd never been in media before. I did bring in our chief creative officer, David Moss, about 6 months in. He had some media experience. He started to guide us a little bit on how to build a brand. We decided to pivot away from Front Porch Media into Evergreen, a bit more contemporary podcast network. And that point, it was like a rocket ship went off, and we've been holding on with our fingernails ever since. We've grown from those original 4, 3 or 4, to now we've got 30 plus employees, probably another 20 1099s all spread out throughout the country. Raised a little over 10 million at this point. Not probably. I mean, we will need to raise another 10 or 15 to kind of hit the goals that we want. Been acquiring a number of companies since last August. We got the go ahead to start, acquiring some really rich IP content, build it up, bring it into the fold. And about 2 years ago, we bought this old radio station. So where I'm interviewing with you is an old radio station that we bought near downtown Cleveland, and we turned it into a podcast studio, or 5 actually. So it's been a whirlwind tour over the last 7.5, 8 years. It's been probably the most provocative time of my life for a number of reasons, not just the business. Obviously, I got married. We had a kid. My wife's been very successful in her career. We've traveled a lot, and there are times where I really want Brandon to like sit down and just take a deep breath and say stop for a minute. But as you know, in the world of business, you really can't. And we're on this trajectory to be, a pretty significant player, I hope, in podcasting. So we'll see where it goes, but it's been a really miraculous journey, and I've really appreciated every moment of it.
Yeah, it sounds super cool. I'm curious though, to go back to Front Porch. What was, you said you were struggling. What was the vision? And then when you pivoted 6 to 18 months in, what did it become that got you to where you are now?
That's a great question. We don't get asked that a lot, but the original premise of Front Porch Media was the front-facing, public-facing platform is actually called Front Porch People. And the family office had the notion that podcasting could be much like the front porches that we grew up on as children, where essentially your neighbors are out there gossiping, relating news stories, talking about the news of the day, and you're getting a front seat education. And it's communal. So the original idea was that podcasting could be communal. We wanted to build podcasts that were essentially in great literature, the Great American Songbook, things that were evergreen in content that you could always go back and review, and then you could share. And it turns out that we probably should have realized this early on, that podcasting is an individual journey, right? Only one person is listening to it at a time. It's not like the old radio days where the family hovered around the radio or the TV and watched things together. So the pivot was, well, how do we create a brand that holds true to our legacy of trying to create as much evergreen content as possible, but be a bit more contemporary, be host centric. A lot of the Front Porch People shows had a rotating cast of characters as hosts because the feeling was the host doesn't matter. It's the content that's really going to drive. And listen, we live in an influencer centric world in a lot of ways in almost everything, right? Politics, business, sports. It's no different in media. And that's when we really started to kind of pivot to, hey, we want strong hosts who've got really deep and granular content that people are going to enjoy. So the initial struggle was just trying to figure out why we weren't getting listens. And it was a pretty simple reply. And that is you're broadcasting out to a large population as a communal endeavor when it's really, I just want to listen to my podcast alone while I'm doing something else, and it sounds so simple, but we thought we were being different and cool and hip at launch. And then, David Moss had the brilliant idea of like, well, let's just call it Evergreen. I mean, that's a very simple thing for people to connect with and understand. And he built a really powerful brand. And then it was up to us then to fill the content pieces. So as we're making that shift away from Front Porch People to Evergreen, I brought in another media expert, a gentleman named Gerardo Orlando, who's our chief content officer. He had started an online magazine, the web 1.0 world where they got online mags and a lot of advertising. And he went through that bubble and burst and just really understood the landscape. He's also a former partner at a large law firm. So he had some, media and legal kind of basis and foundation that we could use. And, when he came on board, I think we had 25 shows. We've got over 350 now. So, the content side, which I'll be frank, I thought was going to be the most challenging part, has probably been the easier part of building the business. But that's kind of the story about how we started and why we made the change.
Yeah, I mean, it makes complete sense. And it's one of those, sounds like it's one of those slap your face moments, like slap yourself in the face. Like, how do we not see this? But we all find ourselves there in some degree, whatever your business is. It's like, oh, duh, the solution was right in front of me. But I'm curious too, because the flip side of that is it's one thing to pivot, change directions, and have a new vision for the company. It's another thing to actually execute and achieve success on it. So in this particular medium, downloads drive the boat, I would assume. I mean, people want to consume your content and you have to get it to them effectively. So
That's right.
How did you grow from a couple thousand downloads in your first year to millions at this point and across 350 plus shows? I mean, that's an incredible feat. And that's something I see a lot of small business owners struggling with, not just podcasting, but getting their social media posts to more people, getting their emails to more people, whatever it is. How did you grow that side of the business?
It's been an evolution. I mean, to be frank, if in the early days, if you had a pulse in a podcast and we liked you, you probably got onto the network. Now it is a game of scale. And if really, well, there's a middle part too. So originally you had a pulse in a podcast, you're on the network. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, we need a little bit of scale, but we couldn't play in the guarantee game. So a lot of the larger podcasts, the hosts, they get minimum guarantees. So they get paid regardless of how well the show operates. We couldn't play in that game. So we had to specialize in podcasts between 5,000 downloads a month to about 85, 90,000. Because at about 2 or 3 years ago, if you had a show over 100,000 downloads a month, you could secure a pretty healthy minimum guarantee and live off that with some modest revenue share. The world has radically changed since then, where shows 200, 300, 500,000 downloads a month cannot secure minimum guarantees. We're a perfect network for that. We want those types of shows. So it's been this evolutionary track, small shows with hosts, and then, that middle market, the Jan Brady shows that were kind of forgotten about on larger networks that had some following. The truth is you need roughly about 10,000 downloads a month to make it revenue positive. I mean, you break even, you've got that opportunity. The great thing about podcasting, as I tell everybody, it's a democratized technology. Anyone can do it. The biggest problem with podcasting, it's a democratized technology. Everyone can do it. So the supply far exceeds listenership, right? So you got to consolidate that. And that's what we're trying to do at the middle market level. Well, it's nearly impossible for us to compete against the iHearts and the Wonderies, which is owned by Amazon. They have tremendous scale that is hundreds of millions of dollars to replicate. But we can secure a pretty strong foothold in that middle market. How do you define that? In our mind, that's 3 million downloads a month to about 10 million downloads a month would be that middle market area. We're fast approaching that. We should, without doing anything else, and obviously we're doing something else, but if we did nothing else, we'd probably be between 36 and 38 million downloads for the year, which is a shade over 3 million a month, right? We've got 2 acquisitions in the fold that are pretty close to being squared away, which could push us over 5.5, 6 million downloads a month. So yeah, it is a scale game, and you got to deliver that. And we also decided to really narrow our focus in genre. There was a point we had 18, 16 different genres. We're methodically starting to cut that down into smaller bite size. Here's another trick of the trade, which may be of interest to you and your listeners, is the B2B segment of podcasting has gotten very, very hot. And so you may have seen a number of B2B podcasts that have come onto the network: Banking Transformed, Truck and Hustle. These shows, even though they deliver a smaller footprint, for both those shows, they're probably between 35 to 40,000 downloads a month. The point is, they're so narrowly focused. Banking Transformed, FinTech Executives, 35,000 a month, right? Truck and Hustle, another 40,000 of logistics and trucking executives. People would pay a premium for that, to the point where Banking Transformed, I feel we could bring in $300,000 to $400,000 a year on that property just in its current format. Now, if it decided to go on the road as an independent, podcast tour, you could probably bring in more. Truck and Hustle does have its own annual event, quarterly events, industry trade shows, so that it's bringing in north of 800,000 a year. Those are significant. So as we kind of talk, now we'll take on a contemporary podcast with an audience. We recently acquired Disturbed. We're doing like 500,000 downloads a month on that show. Great show. It probably will not bring in as much as Truck and Hustle, despite its size, because there's just a ton of true crime and paranormal shows out there, right? So you're fighting that audience. But if you can narrow the scope and be super niche, you can charge premium price in terms of sponsorship and CPM rates for that show. And so you're starting to see a little bit of that too in the background. We're tinkering with more of a business to business approach on our podcasting platform.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's super cool too. I mean, I obviously, as a podcast host, I go on other shows, much like you're doing right now as a guest, me and my business partner, and everyone and their mother has a podcast. And it's the paradox of me saying that. I hear it loud and clear, but a lot of people go into it, I think, without direction, and they do the same thing with their business. As a business consultant, I see that every single day on the business side. People start a business because they just want to start a business. And it's really interesting to see the intention you take with growing your business, acquiring podcasts, acquiring networks, and the ones that are successful are the ones that have the purpose and the vision, and they want to go create something. It's the exact same in business. This conversation overlaps regardless of how you're talking about it. So I'm curious, for where you are now, you said you're doing other things in the background. I understand that. Where are you going in the next 5 or so years based on where you've come from in the last 5 years?
Well, if we can finish off this next acquisition, we'll have 3 distinct and well-branded podcast platforms. So currently we got Converge, which is faith and family. We think there's great upside in the faith and family content play. You got Evergreen as your more contemporary centric, middle of the road podcast platform. This other is probably going to be pop culture, comedy, and more edgier content. So we got the whole spectrum, right? And with a little bit of cross pollination, but probably we try and want to keep the edges on the edge. And then obviously we'll have 4 to 6 niche podcast platforms underneath: the Pit Pass Motorsports, the 5-Minute News, and such. We want those 3 core networks to each hit 10 million downloads a month minimum. So at that point, we'll be hitting 30 million a month. You're kind of hoping you're going to be hitting $4.5 to $6 million, a year per revenue for each of those. So, you're going to hit 18 to 20 million. So there's some science behind that. Behind the scenes, we've spent the last 18 months, and it's been a very challenging 18 months internally, of building out enterprise level infrastructure to handle the vision of where we're going. And by that, I mean, we've spent a lot of time and investment on Megaphone, which is our hosting and distribution platform, owned by Spotify, used by the largest networks. When we approached them, their initial I don't know if you guys are big enough to be using our platform, but we, talked our way into it, got into Megaphone, and it's really the Cadillac of hosting and distribution platforms. Now we're implementing NetSuite because we needed the financial controls and processes in place to handle electronic insertion orders, to handle our contracts, to do project and podcast forecasting on a revenue basis. And that, I got to be honest with you, it's been the most challenging component, because as entrepreneurs, we want to run, and our financial team is like, you can't run that fast yet. Our accountants are literally pulling out their hair of all the acquisitions that we're doing, because they're like, you haven't even gotten your accounting system fully in place yet, and you're just adding more onto it. We love the stress, and we needed to do it, but we're at a point in time where I can't push the brake, because the content opportunities are so great. I don't want to lose out any sort of market opportunities there. But getting back to the conversation, we're putting in NetSuite, and we're also doing HubSpot for our sales and marketing. So 3 enterprise level scalable technology platforms in the background to make sure that we can hit 10 million a month on the 3 podcast networks that we will eventually have. And, maybe larger, but the point is you got to have the infrastructure to control it. And so luckily, our family office has given us at this point, 2.5-3 million just on infrastructure, implementations, and getting the right people and processes in place. This has been over a period of time, obviously. And then, because we're not busy enough, we decided, well, let's take some of this time to launch a FAST or an AVOD network, which would be an advertising supported video on demand channel, because we're just gluttons for punishment. But we've also begun to see this curve where YouTube now is becoming the second largest listening base for podcasts. You're recording both in audio and video, which is what we were suggesting everybody start doing now, because you can play in the audio platforms and the video platforms. But we're seeing something a little different, and that is, and I'll give an example of what I'm seeing, and I hope I can explain this correctly. If you go on to Max, for example, and you watch Game of Thrones, or the new one that's out, immediately when I turn on Game of Thrones, it says, hey, if you like this episode, go listen to our podcast. But I have to leave max, which is stupid. You want that person to stay into that platform as long as freaking possible. So we're going to test out with Evergreen now our theory that it should be audio and video based, depending on what mood or what place that person is at during the day. If I'm doing work, but I need something in the background, right? Because I usually play music or a podcast, then all right, go on Evergreen now, play your favorite podcast. It's in the background, it's fine. If you want to engage in a different way, where you're leaning back and watching, then we've got the podcast and the video format as well. So we're trying to bring in the YouTube experience with the Apple podcast experience or the Spotify podcast into one venue, because we think we can add value that way. And why others aren't doing this is beyond me. Why Max is not vetting the top 10 or 15 Game of Thrones podcasts to put on that platform with their own official podcast is beyond me. It's already an audio platform. You're listening to the show. So why not put in podcasts? So, we've been very fortunate that, the family office that's been supporting us is seeing this vision too. And, we've got a very methodical approach of how we're going to do this. We've signed on with Vimeo. They're going to handle the distribution and the technology for us. And then the next 90 days, we're going to do more internal. So I'll be able to watch it and check it out and see it. And then as we keep on adding content, hopefully first quarter of next year, we'll do a soft launch. Second quarter of next year, we'll do a hard launch. And we'll have Evergreen out there in multiple places, Apple Plus, for example. It'll be embedded on your TVs, within the next year. And that's the big audacious goal. But again, that's enterprise level infrastructure that we have to deploy internally in order to make some of this vision come true.
Yeah, it sounds really cool. I mean, it's one of those mediums where you have people losing trust in mainstream media and even social media, and they still want the content and the information, and they're turning to idiots like me on the internet who who they can relate to and will bring on other people to share that knowledge. So really cool how you're doing it, and the methodical growth, like you said. I'm really curious to follow this journey and how it grows with such a specific approach. I mean, just from hearing it, it sounds like you're taking the path of these other giant networks. I mean, you think about TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. They're integrating everything you could want from the platform in terms of the viewership and shopping experience, the ad experience. You never have to leave the platform. Even if when you go to someone else's website, you're still in Instagram, unless you copy the link and paste it in a browser. They want to keep you there. Everything you're saying is making sense. Really cool that you're bringing this to the world of podcasting and podcast media.
Well, we're trying. I mean, it's, we've worked really hard, and, we're finally starting to get the industry accolades and the industry notice, which is nice. I mean, obviously we're working towards an exit, and, there's always an eye towards, who and when would acquire, Evergreen. And we have been approached, but I tell people, we're a work in progress, and we're not finished. And I don't know if we'll ever be finished, but we need to be further down the road in terms of a completed project before there's some significant value for what we need to have returned back to our investors and to the management team. So we're not quite there yet, but 5-7 years out, I just feel really positive about Evergreen and where we stand. The last 18 months, as I stressed earlier, probably have not been the most fun, because it's just so much, you're in the weeds on getting these systems and procedures and processes in place. We've hired just a ton of new people. And what I really love about that is that, we hire for intellectually curious individuals who are always asking the most important question, which is why. And the team is starting to gel in a way that I'd always hoped, but you never are quite sure, especially when you're adding a lot of new people into the mix. And it's a mix of, very sophisticated, long tenured, CFO types to someone just out of college. And to see the mix downstairs, we've got this big area where employees can congregate and chill while they're having lunch or just kind of taking an afternoon break, and see everyone down there talking and having a good time and challenging each other at times, but also in a fun way, good-natured way. Company culture does mean something in a startup. You got to have it, because most startups, and I think you would agree with this, Brandon, you're in the big muddy with entrepreneurs. Hubris and ego ruin more companies than anything else. That I'm thoroughly convinced about. Yeah. And we didn't want it to happen here.
Yeah, that's the silent killer, and it happens quick. So I love it. This is fantastic. I appreciate you being here, Michael. I put your website, evergreenpodcast.com, on the screen. It's in the show notes down below. I would encourage listeners to go check it out. See what kind of podcasts you got over there, what sort of media you're building. By the time this airs, you might be, who knows, 10 more podcast networks deep in acquisitions. I don't know, but thank you so much for being here. This was fantastic.
Brandon, it was a thrill, man. I really appreciated the time.
Awesome. For those of you watching, listening, wherever you are, make sure you subscribe. We want to continue to grow this channel and this show. And also go check out evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening to Harmonious at Lunch. We'll see you on tomorrow's episode. Keep growing your business. Make it more harmonious.